Alright, today I'm going to be talking about proper exercise order and training and testing. And I feel like this is something that a lot of people don't quite understand. They don't understand why a program is written in a certain way, why the movements are ordered in a particular way throughout a session. They think, well, I want to do this first because I like this, or things like that. But there's a good reason for why in my programming I order things in a specific way. And so I wanted to go over that. And really, the reason behind any ordering of movements in training and testing is going to be a little bit different in training than it is in testing. But you want to allow people to perform the best in each individual movement or test. And so you have to order the movements in a way where the first movement isn't going to interfere with the second movement as much as the second movement would interfere with the first. Where the second movement isn't going to interfere with the third movement as much as the third would interfere with the second if they were reversed. So the first thing, and I'm going to go over testing first and then training because there are some exceptions to the training ordering. So first comes, oh, this is going to work, agility. And agility is just not going to be very physically taxing, and that's why it's placed first. It's based purely around, well, agility. So coordination, accuracy, balance, but it's not going to interfere with really anything else that you do. Next is going to be power. So that can be Olympic lifts, it can be a vertical jump, a long jump, anything like that. It's based upon power, absolute strength comes next. And the reason those two are placed like that, the power work is going to interfere less with the absolute strength work, less than the absolute strength work would interfere with the power work if those were reversed. And so absolute strength can be, max squat, deadlift, bench press, anything like that, slow lifts. After that is going to be strength endurance, if there happens to be a strength endurance test included. Most testing protocols for sports and things like that aren't going to have a strength endurance component, but it happens occasionally. After that's going to be muscular endurance. And I should elaborate on the difference between those two things. So strength endurance is something that's going to have a higher load, but it's still going to be done for a number of repetitions. Muscular endurance is something that's going to be lower load. So an example of that would be muscular endurance would be max push-ups in 2 minutes. So how many push-ups can you do in 2 minutes? Strength endurance could be something like a 225-pound bench press rep test like you see in the NFL Combine. So doing bench pressing 225 pounds as many times as you can consecutively. So that's strength endurance and muscular endurance. And strength endurance, that can also be, it can be the same movement as the absolute strength work. So it can be like an 80% test. So you do, say this is the absolute strength work is a max squat at 3/0 exo tempo. You could take 80% of that, say rest 10 minutes, take 80% of that, same tempo, and do that as many times as you can. So as many squats as possible at 80% of that 1 rep max as you can at the same tempo, so 3/0 exo. And that's going to give you a good indication of neuromuscular efficiency. So that's just an example. It's important to keep in mind that this is going to vary from person to person in terms of what is actually appropriate for testing, because for someone who can only do 3 push-ups, is a max push-up test going to be muscular endurance? No, that's going to be strength work. So just keep that in mind. If you're a coach and you're programming for other people, or if you're programming for yourself, just keep that in mind, that it's going to vary, and you need to, and any sort of testing has to be dependent upon the individual who's performing that testing. Okay, so after muscular endurance, then are going to come the conditioning tests. And so essentially that's going to go from shorter and more high intensity to longer and lower intensity. So if you were to have, say, 3 events, you could have an anaerobic, alactic test, then an anaerobic lactic test, followed by an aerobic test. Now, that would be a lot to do all in one day of testing, and that would take forever if you did all of these things. So you typically won't see that. But a lot of times in athletic testing, you'll see some sort of anaerobic test and followed by some sort of aerobic test. And again, the order is simply because the anaerobic work is going to interfere less with the aerobic work than the aerobic work would with the anaerobic work. I mean, to provide you an example, a lot of times what you might see is something like a 300-yard shuttle test. So it would be done typically on a field. Start at the end zone line, run to the 25-yard line, touch the line, and you go back and forth, touching those lines each time you come across them. And you try to get to 300 yards as fast as possible. And a common aerobic test is, we'll say a 5K run. And so a 5K run, if it's done maximally, is going to blow people up for a shuttle test. And a shuttle test is going to interfere with the run, with the 5K run, but less so than if those were reversed. Which, again, is really the entire thinking behind the ordering of these movements and tests. And so, again, this is going to be really an anaerobic lactic test, the 300-yard shuttle run, followed by an aerobic test, the 5K run. And there are certain testing, this is, pretty standard testing for most sports. And there are obviously competitions where things vary. A good example of that is CrossFit. CrossFit competition, they pay no mind to any of this ordering because it's just something different. A lot of times at the games level, the endurance event, you have some long aerobic event will be placed first. And agility might be thrown somewhere in the middle or towards the end. And so it's all over the place. And part of that's because it's a spectator sport, and you're not going to have the endurance event last because that's not going to be a spectator friendly, and for a spectator sport, that's important. And also, you're going to see in that instance, a lot of the top people are going to remain the same regardless of order of events or what those events are, which is entirely the point of that particular sport, because they're trying to find the fittest. Whereas testing like this is supposed to look very specifically at an individual's strengths and weaknesses so that training can be based around those strengths and weaknesses. It can be designed around that. And so it's not trying to see how much you can suffer over the course of a certain number of days. It's meant to give a coach an idea of what does this individual athlete need to work on to get better. And so for that, you really need to have that order so that they get the most out of each event, and you can see where their strengths and weaknesses actually are. Because if someone really sucks at running, but they're really good at strength work, if they do the strength work first, you're going to see that they're really good at strength work, and you're going to see that they still suck at running. Whereas if you were to reverse those, and they blow themselves up on the running, and then the strength work comes second, you're going to think they suck at both, even if that's not the case. Now when it comes to training, that order doesn't always have to be followed. And so an example of that is with Olympic lifting. So most Olympic lifting training, you're obviously going to put the Olympic lifts. This marker stuff not working anymore. Olympic lifts or variants thereof first, followed by strength-specific work. So it might be something like some snatch or snatch variants. A pull of some sort might come next, like a snatch pull, followed by some squatting, right? But there may be certain times throughout the year where a coach will actually want to reverse those things, and where they would actually do the strength work first and do the Olympic lifts second. So why is that? Why would you want to reverse those things? And the reason is that if you accumulate some fatigue with the strength work, it forces the athlete to work that much harder to move the bar in the Olympic lifts, whatever they happen to be doing on that day. Now, if you accumulate too much fatigue, you're going to have issues with form, and it's going to do the opposite of what you want. So that's something you have to be careful with, and again, it's not appropriate for everyone. That's something that's going to be appropriate for some more advanced lifters at certain times of the year, obviously not getting close to competition, but far out from competition. That can be a good way to get them to really work hard to move the bar. You want to accumulate just enough fatigue to make them work harder, but not so much fatigue that it interferes with their form. And that can be a difficult balance to strike, and it's going to vary from person to person. So that's just an example of that. And then another common example that you'll see is with bodybuilding. A lot of people talk about pre-fatigue. And what pre-fatigue is it's using a smaller movement. It can be an isolation movement, but it doesn't have to be. And following that up with a larger movement, a compound movement that uses the same muscles as whatever movement, the smaller movement that was performed before it. So some examples of that are hamstring curls prior to deadlifting. Leg extensions prior to squatting. I've also seen Bulgarian split squats prior to squatting as well. That's obviously a compound movement. It's a single leg movement, but the loads are obviously going to be much lower than you would see with squatting. Front raises and overhead pressing, flies and bench pressing, those are just a few examples of what pre-fatigue would be. And obviously, if you're training for maximal strength, that's not the best strategy, because that's going to obviously limit the amount of weight that you're able to do for that larger movement. But in terms of hypertrophy, that can be a very good strategy. And also, it can be a great tool for people who are a little bit more prone to injury. So older individuals, that can sometimes be a good way to order their training, because what that allows for is it warms up some of that musculature before they perform that larger movement. It gets them to feel those muscles, and it gives them the ability to contract that muscle a little bit better throughout the movement, and it makes sure that the load is being distributed on the muscles and not just bounced off of the connective tissue. And it's also going to limit the amount of weight that they're able to do on the larger movement. So again, that's not great if you're training for strength development, but if you're training a little bit more for longevity, limiting that amount of weight that you can do for that larger movement can actually be beneficial. So with training, you can obviously vary the order a little bit. It doesn't have to be the same as it is for testing, but there needs to be a good reason why that order of movements is changed. If you do decide to change it, there has to be a good reason for it, and it has to be based upon the individual and what they're actually trying to accomplish in that workout. So that's all for today, and I'll see you next week.